Hello everyone and welcome back. In this class I will continue to use this tower scene file that I used in the last class. If you've saved your file, you can use it. If not, you can use this one with the effects of the previous lesson already saved, which is available for download along with this lesson. In this class I will create a fog effect, using a render pass called Mist. This fog effect could also be created using some volumetric effects directly in the render engines. But creating these volumetric effects directly in the render engines can increase the render time. So, in many situations it can be advantageous to create this kind of effect in post-production, using the compositor and the techniques I'm going to show you. But before I start creating the effect, I'll go back to the Layout workspace. I will click on the View Layers tab of the Properties editor. And I will enable the Mist Pass in the Data Passes panel. The Mist Pass is very similar to the Z Pass, and I will compare them in a future lesson. But for this class, the Mist Pass will be more suitable. To understand what this pass does, we can enable the rendered mode of the viewport. And we can enable the Mist Render Pass in the 3D view by the Shading menu. What this pass does is create a depth mask. This mask is darker on elements closer to the camera, and lighter on elements further away. Before we render and use the Mist Pass in the composition, it is important that we configure its depth. When the Mist Pass is enabled in the View Layers tab, we will find a panel called Mist Pass in the World tab of the Properties editor. In this panel, we can configure how the gradient mask will be distributed over the depth of the scene. In this falloff menu, we can define whether the transition from black to white in the gradient will occur through a quadratic, linear, or inverse quadratic curve. With the quadratic curve, the gradient will tend more towards black, and the transition to white will be more pronounced at the end. Linear mode makes a smooth transition from black to white. And the inverse quadratic mode makes the gradient tend to be more white. This choice will depend on a case-by-case basis. But an interesting way to control the passage from black to white is to leave this parameter with the linear option, and then control the render pass with an adjustment node in the compositor itself. In the start value, we define where the black point of the mask starts. If we increase this value, we will see that the black point of the mask will move away from the camera. But if we do that, everything that is black will have the same value in the mask. I particularly like to leave this value at 0, to have a lot of control over the mask in the regions close to the camera. The depth value defines where the white point of the mask will be. In general, the ideal is for the mask to cover all elements of the scene. So the white point of the mask has to go to the last visible object in the scene. We can configure this in two ways. One of them is to simply increase this depth value until we see the last depth object in the scene. It is important that all objects that we want to appear in the fog are visible when we are configuring this depth. But it is also important that this depth value is not much larger than necessary. If this value is much larger than necessary to cover the entire scene, we will have less control over the fog effect settings. Ideally, the last objects of the scene must be visible in this pass, but they should be in a color very close to the light gray tone of the mask background. In the end, the distance of this parameter should be more or less the distance between the camera and the last object that will appear in the fog. We can try to find this value visually, as we are doing, or we can literally measure the distance from the camera to the last object. To do this, I'm going to momentarily enable the solid mode of the viewport. I'm going to rotate the viewport so that I can see the whole scene. And I will measure it with the ruler of the toolbar. We can enable the ruler in this button here on the toolbar. Then, just click on a point near the camera, and drag to a point near the end of the scene. This measurement don't need to be very precise. But, as we can see, the distance between the camera and the end of the scene is a little over 190 meters. Now, I can simply click on one end of the dashed line, and hit the delete key to delete the ruler. Now, I can activate the camera view again. Enable once again the rendered view mode of the viewport. And numerically configure the depth parameter. I'm going to put 195 meters, so that this distance is in accordance with the measurement I made. With this, the mask will cover the entire depth of the scene. Now I'm going to re-enable the combined render pass in the viewport shading menu. And I will render the scene. When the image is rendered, I'll close the render window and enable the compositing workspace. Now I'm going to start creating the fog effect. But first I'm going to organize the interface so that the effects are organized in the compositor. We are still going to create some effects in this scene, and if we leave all the nodes loose, the interface may be a little confusing. This time, instead of organizing the interface with frames, as we've seen in previous classes, I'm going to organize it with groups. So, I'm going to select all these nodes that we used to configure the shadow and ambient occlusion passes. And I will create a group. To do this, just right-click on any of the selected nodes. And click on Group. This will put all these nodes inside a group. When we are inside the group view, we see that the nodes that were grouped are connected to these group input and group output nodes. Here inside, we can configure these nodes normally. And, if we want to leave the group view, just right-click anywhere. And click Edit Group, or hit the Tab shortcut key. In the main composition we will see a single node representing the group. If we want to enter the group to view the group nodes, we can also right-click on the node. And click on Edit Group. Or use the Tab shortcut key. The Tab key is used to enter and leave the group. If we want to undo the group, just right-click on the group's node. And click on Group. I will redo the group one more time. I will leave the group with the Tab key. And I'm going to rename the group to identify the effect I created with its nodes. For that, I just have to right-click anywhere on the node. And click on Rename. I'm going to rename it Ambient Occlusion and Shadow. Creating groups this way allows us to make complex compositions more organized. Now, I'm going to create the fog effect. For that, I just create a mix node in the Color submenu of the Creation panel. And put it in the main composition. We have already seen that this node allows combining the two inputs through a mask linked to the factor parameter. So, if we connect the mist pass to the factor parameter of the input, The main composition will be combined with the bottom color of the mix node using the mist pass as a mask. This means that we can change the color of the fog by simply changing the color of the second input of node. I'm going to make my color closer to white to create a more conventional fog. Now, to control the intensity of the fog, we can create an RGB curves node in the color submenu of the creation panel. And we can connect the curves node to the mist pass wire. As we can configure the brightness levels with the curves, we have full control over the fog intensity. If we move the point on the left, we change the intensity of the fog in the areas close to the camera. By moving the point on the right, we change the intensity in areas far from the camera. And with intermediate points, we can edit the intensity in the central areas of the fog. This configuration will depend on each project and personal preference. So, just explore the possibilities until you find the effect you want. Now, to keep the composition organized, I'm going to select the Mix node and the RGB Curves node. I'm going to right-click on one of them. And I'm going to click on Group. I will press the Tab key to leave the group. And I'm going to rename this group as Fog. I can also create a reroute node by holding down the Shift key and the right mouse button and dragging over the mist pass wire. This is just an optional compositor organization detail. And with that, we finish this lesson on creating the fog effect with the mist pass. So, thank you for watching, and I see you on the next class.